Leo, oh God, we can't. Not here. The words were a broken whisper, a prayer lost against the cold, unyielding glass of the window overlooking the sleeping city. Her voice, usually so composed, was frayed with a desperate pleasure, a sound that didn't belong in the sterile silence of the Vance Corporation tower. His reply was a low murmur against the sensitive skin of her neck, a vibration that seemed to calm the frantic beat of her heart, even as his actions pushed her further into the storm. Shh, Eleanor, just for a moment. Just feel this. Her manicured fingers, which had spent the day shaking hands at a meaningless luncheon, were now clenched, digging into the rough navy blue fabric of his work shirt, a stark contrast to the silken material of her own dress, which was now bunched high around her waist. The cool air of the empty office kissed her exposed thighs, a shocking intimacy that sent a shiver through her, a tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. Below them, the city was a tapestry of distant, glittering lights, a million lives moving in predictable patterns, entirely unaware of the raw, elemental secret being shared 48 floors above them. This was the world of Eleanor Vance, a woman sculpted from old money and new expectations, the beautiful, porcelain wife of the titan of industry, Richard Vance. Her life was a carefully curated exhibition of perfection, housed within a gilded cage of penthouse apartments and exclusive charity events. But in the hollow quiet of the nights, when her powerful husband was either in another city or asleep in another room, she felt less like a person and more like a ghost, haunting the opulent spaces that were meant to be her paradise. And then there was him. He was Leo Martinez, a man whose reality was the polished marble floors and the hum of the cleaning equipment in the dead of night. He moved through the empty canyons of the corporate headquarters, a silent observer in a world he was paid to make spotless but never truly be a part of. He was solid, real, with calluses on his hands and a quiet depth in his dark eyes. And those eyes, they saw something no one else bothered to look for. They didn't see Mrs. Vance, the CEO's appendage. They saw Eleanor, the woman who sometimes lingered too long by the windows, her gaze lost in the infinite distance, her elegant shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the diamonds she wore. Their two worlds were never meant to collide, separated by a chasm of wealth, status, and expectation. But in the suffocating silence of the great glass tower, loneliness had a way of building its own bridges. Eleanor's world was painted in shades of expensive, soul-crushing beige. It was the color of the sprawling penthouse apartment, a minimalist masterpiece of marble, glass, and muted tones that felt more like a modern art gallery than a home. Each morning, she awoke not to an alarm, but to the silent, computerized hum of the blackout blinds retracting, revealing a panoramic view of New York City that most people only saw in magazines. The city sprawled beneath her, a vibrant, chaotic organism, yet she felt completely disconnected from it, as if she were observing it from inside a hermetically sealed jar. Her husband, Richard Vance, was a man forged from ambition and cold currency. He didn't occupy their home so much as he passed through it, a whirlwind of tailored suits, barking phone calls, and the faint, metallic scent of power. Their mornings were a ritual of distance. He would already be dressed, reading the Wall Street Journal on a tablet at one end of a comically long dining table, while she sat at the other, pushing a few pieces of fruit around a porcelain plate. His kiss was a dry, brief press against her cheek, an item checked off a daily list. Their conversations were transactions. He'd say, "The Harrington Gala is tonight. Wear the blue dress. It matches the sapphire necklace I bought you." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive, an instruction for how his most valuable asset should be displayed. She would reply, "Of course, Richard," her voice a perfect melodic instrument trained to never betray the emptiness behind the notes. Her days were a meticulously scheduled series of luxurious obligations. A private Pilates instructor who praised her form but never asked about her feelings. A lunch with other corporate wives, where the conversation revolved around summering in the Hamptons and the outrageous cost of redecorating, a subtle ballet of one-upmanship disguised as friendly chatter. Eleanor would smile, contribute an anecdote, and feel a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were an actress who had been playing the same role for so long she'd forgotten her own lines. She would walk through her own home, trailing her fingers over priceless sculptures and sofas no one ever sat on, and feel nothing. The space was filled with objects of immense value, but it was devoid of worth, devoid of life. It was a beautiful, silent tomb, and the silence was the loudest sound she knew. It screamed of things unsaid, of passions unclaimed, of a vibrant young art student who had once dreamed of painting messy, emotional canvases but had instead become a pristine, untouched sculpture herself. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple she could only see through triple-paned glass, her world would contract and shift its focus to the Vance Tower, the monolithic glass and steel monument to her husband's ego. And as her day of performative existence was ending, Leo Martinez's was just beginning. Leo's world was one of echoes and solitude, of chemicals and quiet contemplation. He entered the Vance Tower through a discreet service entrance in the back, a world away from the grand marble-floored lobby where people like Eleanor made their entrances. He'd trade his worn jeans and t-shirt for the simple navy blue uniform that rendered him largely invisible, a part of the building's nocturnal machinery. His kingdom was the building after it had exhaled, after the frantic energy of the day had dissipated, leaving behind only the ghosts of ambition in the form of discarded coffee cups and overflowing wastebaskets. He wasn't just a cleaner, he was an archaeologist of the corporate soul. He could tell by the contents of a trash can who was thriving and who was barely surviving. He saw the crumpled drafts of resignation letters, the empty antidepressant packets, the half-eaten celebratory cakes from deals that had been won. He saw the raw, unfiltered humanity that was carefully hidden behind power suits and confident handshakes during the day. While Eleanor's world was silent with emptiness, Leo's was silent with peace. He found a rhythm in his work, the steady hum of his industrial vacuum cleaner, a kind of mantra, the squeak of his cart's wheels, a familiar companion in the long, empty hallways. He worked his way up, floor by floor, restoring order to the chaos of the day. He polished the long boardroom tables where fortunes were made and lost, seeing his own distorted reflection in their perfect surfaces. He wiped away the fingerprints from the glass walls of the executive offices, feeling like he was erasing the very presence of the powerful men who occupied them. And it was during these quiet hours, in the highest, most rarefied floors of the tower, that he had first started noticing her. He didn't know her name then. To him, she was just the lady in the glass castle. Long after the last stressed executive had rushed home, he would sometimes see a single light burning in Richard Vance's corner office on the 48th floor. And there she would be. She wasn't the poised, smiling woman whose picture he occasionally saw on the society pages someone had left behind. The woman he saw was different. He saw her with her shoes kicked off, her feet curled up beneath her on a ridiculously expensive sofa. He saw her staring out at the city lights, the same view Eleanor saw from her penthouse, but he could tell from her posture, from the slight slump of her shoulders, that she wasn't admiring the view. She was trying to escape into it. He saw the mask of perfection fall away, revealing a profound and captivating sadness. He felt a strange kinship with her solitude. He was alone by choice, by circumstance. He sensed that she was alone by design, trapped in a life that surrounded her with people but never allowed for a single, genuine connection. He would deliberately slow his work on that floor, giving her space, never wanting to intrude on her private melancholy. He would empty the trash cans and dust the shelves in the outer offices, always aware of her silent presence just beyond the glass wall. His interest wasn't lustful or covetous. It was something quieter, more empathetic. It was the simple recognition of another lonely soul, adrift in the vast, impersonal ocean of the city night. He was the watcher on the ground, and she was the princess in the tower, and neither of them knew that the silent, invisible threads of fate were slowly, inexorably pulling their two solitary worlds together. The Harrington Gala was in full swing, a glittering affair hosted on the 50th floor event space of the Vance Tower. It was an ecosystem of calculated smiles, air kisses that never landed, and the incessant high-pitched hum of networking. Eleanor stood at the epicenter of it all, a vision in royal blue silk, the famous Vance sapphires resting coolly against her skin. The necklace was a masterpiece, a gift from Richard to mark their 10th anniversary, but tonight it felt less like a gift and more like a collar, beautiful and impossibly heavy. She moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, her smile a flawless, unwavering shield. She laughed at a banker's terrible joke, inquired about a senator's wife's trip to Tuscany, and complimented the garish diamond earrings of a woman whose name she couldn't remember. She was playing her part to perfection, the consummate hostess, the elegant and untouchable Mrs. Vance. But beneath the silken sapphires, a scream was building in her chest, a silent, desperate howl of loneliness. Richard was supposed to be here, by her side. It was his company's event, his name on the invitations. Her phone vibrated in her small clutch, and she excused herself with another perfect smile, stepping through a glass door onto a small, windswept balcony. It was Richard. His voice was clipped, distant, crackling with the energy of a time zone half a world away. "How's it going?" he asked, a question devoid of genuine interest. It was a check-in, a status report. "Everything is wonderful, Richard. Everyone is asking for you," she said, the lie smooth on her tongue. "Good, good," he replied, distracted. She could hear the clinking of glasses on his end, the murmur of other voices. "Listen, Eleanor, the deal here in Shanghai is taking longer than I thought. I won't be back until Friday." There was no apology, no softness, just a statement of fact. A wave of cold disappointment washed over her, so familiar it was almost comforting. "Oh," was all she could manage. "Well, I hope it goes well." He wasn't listening. "Just keep everyone happy," he commanded, his voice turning sharp. "And for God's sake, remember to thank the Harringtons personally. You're my best asset tonight, Eleanor. Make sure you look the part." Asset. The word struck her like a slap. Not a partner, not a wife. An asset. Something to be polished, displayed, and leveraged. Before she could respond, he had hung up. The connection was cut, but she stood frozen on the balcony, the cold night air doing nothing to numb the hot shame and fury coursing through her. She couldn't go back in there. She couldn't paste the smile back on her face and pretend to be the gracious, fulfilled wife of the man who saw her as a piece of property. The polite chatter from inside the ballroom sounded grotesque, the music a funeral dirge. She needed to escape. Turning her back on the party, she slipped down a private stairwell, her heels clicking nervously on the cold metal steps. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed silence. She needed darkness. She found herself on the 48th floor, the executive level. It was dark and deserted, a ghost town of immense power. She pushed open the heavy oak door to a conference room, a vast, shadowy space dominated by a long, gleaming table. The only light came from the city itself, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She sank into one of the plush leather chairs, the one at the far end of the table, and the dam finally broke. The tears came without a sound, hot tracks ruining the expensive makeup she had spent an hour applying. A sob caught in her throat, a painful, ragged sound in the immense quiet. She buried her face in her hands, the silk of her dress feeling alien against her skin, the weight of the sapphires choking her. She was a pathetic cliché, the rich, miserable wife crying alone in the dark. The self-loathing was as sharp as the grief. It was in this state of total surrender that she first heard it, a faint, rhythmic, squeaking sound approaching in the hallway. Her head snapped up, her heart seizing with panic and embarrassment. A slice of light appeared as the door was pushed gently open. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, pushing a large cleaning cart. It was the janitor. Her mind raced. She tried to wipe her face, to compose herself, to somehow become invisible. He surely saw her, a crumpled heap of blue silk in the shadows. He paused for a beat, and in that moment, Eleanor braced herself for the inevitable awkwardness, a hasty retreat, a mumbled apology, or, worst of all, the fumbling, well-intentioned question, "Are you okay, ma'am?" But he did none of those things. He simply pushed his cart into the room, his movements calm and deliberate. He began his work at the opposite end of the vast room, emptying a small wastebasket, his actions creating a soft, oddly comforting series of sounds. He was giving her a moment, a small pocket of dignity. He was pretending not to see her, and in doing so, he saw her more clearly than anyone had all night. After a few minutes of this quiet, respectful activity, the squeaking of his cart's wheels stopped beside the table, a few feet away from her. She kept her face down, her hair a curtain hiding her shame. She saw him from the corner of her eye as he reached into his cart. He wasn't looking at her. He placed a bottle of chilled water on the polished surface of the table, its side immediately misting over in the cool air. Next to it, he laid a crisp, perfectly folded paper towel. Simple offerings. Practical, human. He still didn't speak. He moved to the window, looking out at the same city lights that had felt so mocking to her just moments before. He leaned one hand against the glass, his posture relaxed, as if they were two strangers simply sharing a view. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, a calm baritone that didn't startle the silence but became a part of it. He said, "Sometimes the silence up here is too loud, isn't it?" The words landed in her soul with the force of a revelation. He hadn't asked what was wrong. He hadn't offered a useless platitude. He had, with one simple, profound observation, named the very essence of her suffering. He understood. This man in a janitor's uniform, this complete stranger, understood the crushing weight of her gilded, silent world. Eleanor slowly lifted her head, her tear-streaked face exposed. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the very first time. He wasn't looking at her with pity, but with a quiet, knowing empathy. There was no judgment in his dark eyes, only a shared understanding of solitude. "Yes," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Yes, it island." He gave a slow, small nod, a gesture of complete comprehension. And then, without another word, he turned, pushed his cart out of the room, and gently pulled the door closed, leaving her alone once more. But the silence he left behind was different. It was no longer a screaming void. It was calm, filled with the echo of an unexpected kindness. She stared at the bottle of water, a perfect, glistening teardrop on the dark wood. It was the most real thing she had touched all day. The days following the Harrington Gala were strangely altered for Eleanor. The beige emptiness of her penthouse seemed more pronounced, the silence of her life more deafening. Richard's brief, impersonal texts from Shanghai felt like messages from a distant planet. Yet, threaded through the oppressive quiet, was the memory of a low, steady voice and a simple, profound question. The janitor, she didn't even know his name, had offered her a moment of grace that shone like a beacon in the fog of her existence. That single act of kindness became an obsession, a puzzle she needed to revisit. It was a foolish, dangerous impulse, she knew, but it was also the only thing that felt real. So, 2 nights later, she found herself driving back to the Vance Tower long after the sun had set. She told her driver it was to finalize some documents for the foundation. The lie tasted clumsy in her mouth, but the pull towards that building, towards that possibility of connection, was stronger than her sense of propriety. She rode the silent elevator up to the 48th floor, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. What was she even doing? What would she say? The floor was dark, just as it had been the other night. She walked the plush corridors, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and then she heard it, the distant, familiar hum of a vacuum cleaner. She followed the sound and found him on the 45th floor, his back to her, methodically guiding the machine over the floor of an empty office. For a moment, she just watched, an intruder in his world of quiet labor. He moved with an unhurried, efficient grace. Taking a breath, she stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud. He switched off the machine, and the sudden silence was immense. He turned, and his eyes registered a flicker of surprise, but no alarm. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone even and respectful. I wanted to thank you," she began, feeling a ridiculous blush creep up her neck. "For the other night, for the water. You were very kind." He simply nodded. Everyone needs a glass of water now and then. He wasn't making it easy for her, but he wasn't making it difficult either. He was just present. "I never got your name," she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "It's Leo," he replied. "Leo Martinez." "Eleanor," she said, offering her own name as if it were a secret she was finally sharing. "It's nice to meet you, Leo." The exchange hung in the air, simple but significant. They had shed their titles. They were no longer the CEO's wife and the janitor. They were Eleanor and Leo. That brief, slightly awkward encounter was the beginning. It became their unspoken ritual. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, Eleanor would find a plausible reason to be in the tower after hours. She would wander the quiet floors until she found him, and they would talk. At first, their conversations were tentative, explorations of safe territory. They talked about the city, the way it looked from up high, a silent, glittering jewel box. But soon, the walls began to come down, brick by fragile brick. He was the first to offer a piece of his true self. One night, as they sat in a deserted employee lounge with a view over the Hudson River, she noticed him scribbling in a small, battered notebook. "What are you writing?" she asked, her curiosity genuine. He hesitated for a second, then slid the notebook across the table. It was filled with observations, snippets of overheard conversations, character sketches written in a neat, concise hand. "I want to be a writer," he admitted, a quiet pride in his voice. "I write about the things people don't see. The night shift workers, the delivery drivers, the people who keep the city breathing while everyone else is asleep." Eleanor was captivated. He spoke of the invisible world he inhabited with such passion and clarity, and she felt a painful pang of recognition. She was invisible too, just in a much more crowded, well-lit room. His vulnerability was a key, unlocking a door inside her that had been sealed for over a decade. The following week, she found the courage to talk about her own buried dreams. "I used to paint," she said, the words feeling strange and foreign. He didn't just nod politely. He leaned forward, his dark eyes focused intently on her. "What did you paint?" he asked. And so, she told him. She described the exhilarating mess of her college art studio, the intoxicating smell of turpentine and oil paints. She told him about her final project, a huge, chaotic canvas of a screaming face, rendered in violent reds and desperate blues. A painting so filled with raw emotion that her professor had called it unflinchingly honest. Richard had hated it. "It's ugly," he had said, shortly after they started dating. "Why would you want to put something so unpleasant on a wall?" Slowly, without realizing it, she had stopped painting. His world of clean lines, profitable mergers, and emotionless transactions had no room for her messy, unpleasant honesty. As she spoke, she felt a profound sense of release, as if she were excavating a part of herself she thought had been buried forever. Leo listened. He truly listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but absorbing her words, understanding the grief that lay beneath them. "I would have liked to have seen that painting," he said softly when she had finished. And in that moment, Eleanor felt a connection more intimate than any physical touch she had ever known from her husband. Their midnight conversations became her lifeline. She learned about his family in Ecuador, about the younger sister he was helping to put through college. He learned about the books she loved, the poetry that made her heart ache. They were building a world for themselves in the twilight hours, a secret island in the middle of the vast, empty ocean of the Vance Tower. The thrumming desire she felt wasn't physical, not yet. It was a deeper, more urgent craving, the thirst to be seen, the hunger to be known. Every conversation left her feeling more alive, more herself. Driving home through the deserted streets of Manhattan in the early hours of the morning, the city lights would blur through her windshield, and she would feel a dangerous, exhilarating mix of joy and terror. She was no longer just the ghost in the machine. She was a woman with a secret that was beginning to feel more real and vital than her entire life. The nature of their midnight meetings began to change, slowly at first, then with an undeniable momentum. The conversations, which had been a sanctuary for their minds, now became the charged space between their bodies. A comfortable silence would fall between them, and instead of being filled with peaceful understanding, it would now hum with a palpable, unspoken tension. It was an awareness that grew in the space of a held breath, in the way they were careful not to let their knees touch as they sat in the darkened lounge. The emotional intimacy they had built had created a powerful vacuum, and now, physical desire was rushing in to fill it. For Eleanor, this new current was both terrifying and intoxicatingly liberating. She began to engage in a secret ritual of rebellion. Her public life was a performance of restrained elegance, but her preparation for her nights with Leo became a private reclamation of her own sensuality. After a sterile charity dinner or a tense evening with Richard's business partners, she would return to the silent penthouse and begin to transform. She would unclasp the heavy diamond earrings, peel off the restrictive designer dress, and step out of the armor she wore for the world. Then, in the privacy of her cavernous walk-in closet, she would choose her outfit for Leo. It was never anything overt or flashy. It was a language of subtlety, meant only for an audience of one. She would select a simple, dark cashmere sweater, one whose softness she knew would invite the idea of touch. She'd choose a silk blouse in a deep burgundy, leaving one more button undone than she ever would during the day, exposing the delicate arch of her collarbone. She started wearing her hair down, letting it fall in soft waves around her shoulders instead of the severe, elegant chignon she favored for public appearances. Perhaps the most intimate act of all was the perfume. She had her day scent, a crisp, floral fragrance that was as bright and impersonal as a corporate lobby. But for Leo, she would apply a single, discreet drop of a different perfume to her wrists and the warm spot just behind her ears. It was a scent of sandalwood, amber, and a hint of vanilla. It was dark, warm, and deeply personal, a fragrance that smelled not of wealth, but of skin. It was her secret signal, a silent message sent into the quiet hallways of the tower. Leo noticed everything. His quiet, observant nature, which had first allowed him to see her sadness, was now attuned to this new, blossoming sensuality. The shift was evident in his gaze. It had always been kind and attentive, but now it held a different quality, a deep, magnetic pull that both thrilled and unnerved her. His eyes would no longer just meet hers. They would take a longer, more deliberate journey. They would rest for a fraction of a second too long on her lips as she spoke. They would follow the graceful movement of her hand as she gestured, as if he were memorizing the shape of her fingers. One evening, as she leaned forward to emphasize a point, the collar of her blouse gaped slightly. His gaze dipped for a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, but she saw it. She saw the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way he had to physically pull his eyes back up to meet hers. There was a raw hunger in that look, but it was tempered by a profound respect, a restraint that made it all the more powerful. It was a look that said, "I see all of you, and I want you, but I will not take what is not offered." Their words began to dance around this new tension. He never complimented her beauty in a conventional way, which she was used to and immune to. Instead, his compliments were far more intimate. "You smell nice tonight, Eleanor," he said one evening, his voice a low rumble. She felt a jolt, as if he had reached out and touched her. "It's called Nuit Fauve," she whispered, the name of the perfume feeling like a shared secret. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Wild night," he translated softly. "It suits you." Another time, she wore the burgundy silk blouse. "That color," he said, his eyes intense. "It reminds me of the description of a sunset in a book I once read, the kind of beautiful that hurts a little bit." No one had ever spoken to her like that. Men complimented her clothes, her jewelry, her face. Leo complimented the emotion a color evoked when she wore it. He was seeing her essence, not just her surface. The breaking point came on a cool Tuesday night. She was telling him about a difficult memory, a story about her father, a cold and demanding man who had praised her for her beauty but dismissed her art. Her voice grew thick with unshed tears, and her carefully constructed composure began to crumble. She was looking down at her hands, twisting a ring on her finger, when a single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. "Don't be," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. And then he moved. It was a small, simple gesture that shattered the world. He reached across the small space separating them and placed his hand on her forearm. It wasn't a pat or a fleeting touch. His hand rested there, his fingers wrapping gently around her arm, his thumb stroking the soft cashmere of her sweater. The shock of it was electric. A current shot up her arm, igniting every nerve ending in her body. She could feel the slight roughness of his calluses through the fine wool, a testament to a life of physical work so different from her own. She could feel the solid, grounding warmth of his palm, a heat that seemed to seep directly into her bones, chasing away a chill she hadn't realized she was carrying for years. She stopped speaking. She stopped breathing. She slowly lifted her head, and her tear-filled eyes met his. In his gaze, she saw all the unspoken words, all the pent-up longing, all the desperate, dangerous tenderness. The air crackled. The quiet hum of the building's ventilation system faded into nothingness. There was only the feeling of his hand on her arm and the magnetic intensity of his eyes. An eternity seemed to pass in that silent moment. He hadn't tried to wipe her tear. He hadn't offered a comforting squeeze. He was simply holding her, anchoring her. Finally, as if breaking a spell, he slowly withdrew his hand. but the sensation lingered, a phantom brand on her skin. The conversation faltered after that, both of them too aware of the profound shift that had just occurred. A line had been crossed, not with a passionate kiss, but with a single, compassionate touch. As she rode the elevator down alone, Eleanor pressed her own hand to the spot on her arm where his had been, trying to preserve the feeling. The unspoken language of looks and words had finally been given a voice through touch. And it was a voice that whispered of inevitability, of transgression, and of a desire so powerful it threatened to consume them both. The memory of his touch had become a permanent resident under her skin. For days, Eleanor felt its phantom warmth on her arm, a constant tingling reminder of the line that had been crossed. The air in their midnight meetings was now so thick with unspoken longing it was difficult to breathe. They still talked, but their words felt like a flimsy veil over a much deeper, more primal conversation their bodies were trying to have. They were standing in a deserted hallway on the 47th floor, bathed in the cool blue glow of a digital advertising screen, the silence around them as vast as the night sky outside. He had just finished telling her a funny story about his childhood, and she had laughed, a genuine, uninhibited sound that felt alien and wonderful. As her laughter subsided, she looked up at him, and the smile faded from her lips, replaced by an expression of unguarded vulnerability. He was looking at her with that same raw, restrained hunger, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that if he didn't kiss her in the next 10 seconds, she might actually shatter. It was in that moment of fragile, suspended reality that the world intruded. A sharp, metallic jingle of keys echoed from the far end of the corridor, followed by the firm, rhythmic squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the marble floor. Panic, cold and immediate, seized Eleanor. It was a security guard. A new one. She registered dimly. Someone who didn't know the building's silent, after-hours routines. Leo's reaction was instantaneous. His relaxed posture vanished, replaced by a tense alertness. "This way," he hissed, his hand grabbing hers the second time he had ever touched her, but this time it was not a gentle comfort, but a firm, urgent command. He pulled her along, his grip strong and sure, her expensive heels stumbling to keep up. He didn't head for a stairwell or an office, but for a plain, unmarked door she had never noticed before. He twisted the knob, pulling her into pitch blackness just as a flashlight beam sliced through the space they had occupied a second before. The door clicked shut behind them, plunging them into a claustrophobic, absolute dark. The space was tiny, and the air was thick with the sharp, sterile scent of bleach and old paper, an aggressive chemical smell that was instantly and bizarrely mingled with the warm, intimate notes of her sandalwood perfume. They were pressed together, his back against the door, listening. Eleanor's entire body was flush against his, her cheek pressed into the rough fabric of his uniform shirt. She could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his heart against her own, or maybe it was hers. She couldn't tell. Their ragged breaths were the only sound in the suffocating space. Outside, the footsteps slowed, paused, and then continued on, the squeaking fading down the hall until it was gone. The immediate danger had passed, but a far more potent and volatile threat was now sealed in the tiny, dark closet with them. The silence that descended was heavier, more charged than any they had ever shared. Leo slowly, carefully, turned in the small space to face her. His body brushed against hers, a long, searing line of contact from chest to knee. There was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to hide from the raw, undeniable truth of their attraction. She could feel his warm breath on her forehead, could sense his hands hovering in the darkness between them. One of his hands came up, the movement hesitant, and his fingers gently cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Eleanor," he whispered, and her name on his lips was a sound of complete undoing. It was the only spark needed to ignite the inferno. The kiss was a collision, a desperate mutual claiming. It was not the tender, exploratory kiss of romance. It was a raw, frantic expression of weeks of suppressed longing. It was clumsy and urgent, his lips hard against hers, her hands flying up to clutch at his shoulders as if she were falling. She pulled back for a fraction of a second, a gasp escaping her lips, the last vestiges of her conscience fighting a losing battle. "Leo, no," she breathed, the words a hollow protest. "We can't, we shouldn't." Her mind was screaming warnings, flashing images of her husband, her life, the inevitable ruin, but her body, starved for so long, was no longer listening. His other hand found the small of her back, molding to her, pulling her against the hard ridge of his desire. "Just one kiss, Eleanor," he pleaded, his voice thick with a need that mirrored her own. Just one. He knew it was a lie. She knew it was a lie. And as his mouth found hers again, deeper this time, a broken moan of pure surrender escaped her throat, and she gave herself over to the truth. The kiss dissolved any remaining thought. His hands were everywhere, no longer gentle. One tangled in her hair, tilting her head back to give him better access to her neck, while the other slid down her spine, a fiery path over the silk of her blouse, coming to rest on the curve of her hip. With a strength that surprised her, he lifted her effortlessly, seating her on what felt like a sturdy stack of cardboard boxes, bringing her face to level with his. Her skirt, a soft, flowing thing of wool, rode up high on her thighs, exposing them to the cool, dark air. His hands moved from her waist, sliding up the bare skin of her legs, a slow, torturous exploration that made her gasp. His touch was a revelation, the rough, calloused skin of his working hands against the soft, smooth skin she spent a fortune maintaining. It was the ultimate transgression, a collision of their two disparate worlds enacted in the dark. His fingers traced the delicate lace edge of her underwear, and she arched into his touch, a silent plea. He cupped her, his thumbs pressing into the soft flesh of her buttocks through the thin, expensive fabric, pulling her hips flush against his. The raw, physical evidence of his need was undeniable, and it set off a corresponding fire deep inside her. What happened next was a blur of frantic, primal urgency. It was not making love, it was a desperate, almost violent claiming. There were no gentle words, only the sound of torn fabric, the rustle of clothes being pushed aside, her own stifled cries as he entered her. It was hurried, clumsy, and utterly overwhelming. She wrapped her legs around his waist, clinging to him, meeting his rhythm with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed. In the darkness of that anonymous storage closet, surrounded by the mundane tools of his trade, Eleanor Vance ceased to exist. There was only a woman, raw and needy, and a man who saw her, and in that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. The silence that followed their frantic coupling in the dark was more profound than any they had ever shared before. It was a heavy, loaded, quiet, filled with the scent of sex and bleach, and the deafening sound of two hearts gradually slowing from a frantic gallop. They untangled themselves with a clumsy, awkward choreography, adjusting clothing in the pitch blackness, the rustle of fabric a testament to their transgression. There were no words. What could be said? When Leo finally opened the door a crack, peering into the empty, silent corridor, the slice of low light felt like a harsh judgment. He glanced back at her, his face shadowed and unreadable, then gave a slight nod. The walk to the service elevator was agonizingly long, a silent procession of two people who were now irrevocably bound by a shared secret. He didn't touch her. She didn't look at him. The spell was broken, and the cold, hard reality of the world was waiting for them outside the tower's enchanted nocturnal walls. The drive home was a complete blur to Eleanor. She operated on autopilot, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road, but her mind was a raging storm. When she finally slipped into her own bed in the pre-dawn stillness of her penthouse, sleep was an impossibility. Her body was a live wire, humming with the aftershocks of his touch, while her mind was a courtroom where she was both the criminal and the prosecutor. When morning came, heralded by the silent, automated ascent of her bedroom blinds, Eleanor felt as though she were waking up for the first time in her life. For a single, blissful second, the world was as it had been. Then, the memory of the night before crashed down on her, not as a hazy dream, but as a vivid sensory assault. She could still feel the roughness of his work shirt under her frantic fingers, the solid weight of him, the shocking, exquisite friction of his skin against hers. She lay motionless on her 1,000-thread-count sheets, a prisoner of her own awakened body. This was the echo of pleasure. It was a physical haunting. In the shower, the jets of hot water against her skin felt intensely sensual, and she closed her eyes, imagining it was his hands. She saw the faint, purplish marks on the pale skin of her inner thighs, the ghost of his grip, and a jolt of shame and exhilaration shot through her in equal measure. Her body, for so long a vessel to be maintained, dieted, and adorned for her husband's world, now felt like her own. It was a living, breathing entity with its own desires, its own history, its own secrets. It felt thrillingly, dangerously alive. But as the pleasure echoed, so too did the guilt. As she stood before the vast mirror in her dressing room, wrapped in a silk robe, the woman staring back at her was a stranger. On the surface, she was the same, but underneath she was fundamentally altered. She was an adulteress. The word was a poison dart in her mind, ugly and sordid. She thought of Richard, not with the distant fondness of a long-term marriage, but with the cold, sharp dread of a liar. His face, which had become a familiar, almost forgettable part of her landscape, was now the face of her betrayal. Every object in her perfect, sterile life seemed to accuse her. The multi-million-dollar painting on the wall, a gift from Richard, felt like the unblinking eye of a witness. The platinum wedding band on her finger felt heavy as lead, a brand of her hypocrisy. She made coffee from a machine that cost more than a car, the rich aroma filling the silent kitchen, but it all felt like a charade. She was an imposter in her own life, a life built on a foundation she had just willingly dynamited. Yet, for every wave of guilt that threatened to drown her, a powerful undertow of pure, unadulterated longing would pull her back. Her mind became a relentless replay of the night before, obsessively dissecting every detail. The way he'd whispered her name in the darkness, a prayer and a curse. The surprising strength in his hands. The way he had looked at her in the hallway just before the guard had come, a look that had stripped her bare long before he had touched her clothes. This was the craving, a hunger so deep and so potent it terrified her. It was a thirst for the way he made her feel, seen, desired, and devastatingly real. As the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows from the skyscrapers, Leo Martinez was finishing his shift. He sat on the nearly empty 7 train, heading east into Queens, the city's gleaming facade receding behind him. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, but his gaze, fixed on the passing cityscape, was clear and contemplative. He wasn't consumed by the same frantic mix of pleasure and guilt as Eleanor. His emotions were quieter, heavier. He felt the immense, terrifying weight of what they had done. He, a janitor, had slept with the wife of one of the most powerful men in the city, in the man's own building. The power imbalance was a chasm, the risks almost entirely his. He could lose everything, his job, his ability to support his family, his quiet, unassuming life. Yet, as he inventoried these potential losses, he felt a startling absence of regret. His mind wasn't on the consequences, it was on her. He thought of the raw courage it took for a woman like her to open up to someone like him. He thought of her laugh in the empty hallway. He thought of the single tear that had traced a path down her cheek. And he thought of the surprising, fierce passion she had unleashed in that tiny, dark closet. It wasn't just lust. He had connected with something essential within her, a caged and desperate part of her soul, and in doing so, had revealed a part of his own. He knew with a sobering certainty that the quiet, simple bridge of their late-night conversations had been burned. They couldn't go back to the way things were. The dynamic had been irrevocably altered. They were no longer just friends, no longer confidants. They were co-conspirators, partners in a crime of passion. As he got off the train and walked the familiar streets of his neighborhood, the rising sun warming his face, he knew their story wasn't over. It had just truly begun. And miles away, in her gilded cage, Eleanor stood at her window, looking out at the same Sunday. Her guilt had not subsided, but her resolve had hardened. The risk was immense, the potential for ruin absolute, but the thought of never feeling that alive again, of never being with him again, was a fate far worse than any consequence she could imagine. The question was no longer if, it was only, and desperately when. The week that followed their transgression in the storage closet was a study in exquisite torture. They would see each other during Eleanor's late-night visits, but the dynamic had shifted from quiet intimacy to a taut, vibrating suspense. Their conversations were shorter, filled with charged silences and the unspoken memory of what had passed between them in the dark. Every shared glance was a question, every moment of proximity, a physical ache. The craving had become a constant companion for Eleanor, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of her placid life. It was a hunger that no luxurious meal could satisfy, a thirst no vintage champagne could quench. The frantic, clumsy release in the closet had not sated her desire, it had only shown her the depths of her own starvation. She realized with a chilling clarity that she could not leave their fate to chance again. She could not wait for another accidental meeting in a darkened hallway, or another security guard to push them together. The thought of not being with him again was a physical pain, a slow suffocation. The decision solidified on a Thursday evening. She was seated at a charity auction dinner next to Richard, who was holding court, laughing with a real estate mogul, his hand resting performatively on the small of her back. The touch was possessive, passionless, the touch of a man claiming his property. And in that moment, looking at her husband's self-satisfied profile, a cold, hard rebellion crystallized in Eleanor's heart. This act, this next step, would not be a moment of weakness or a surrender to circumstance. It would be a choice. It would be an act of war. Later that night, she found Leo on the 39th floor, polishing the brass fixtures by the elevator bank. He looked up as she approached, and the polite mask he wore for the world dissolved when his eyes met hers. He saw the new, dangerous resolve in her expression. She didn't bother with pretenses or small talk. "Meet me," she said, her voice a low, steady command that surprised even herself. 48th floor, in an hour. She didn't need to specify the room, they both knew. The 48th floor had only one destination that mattered: the corner office, the seat of the king, the throne room of Richard Vance. An hour later, Eleanor stood in the center of her husband's inner sanctum. The office was an extension of Richard himself, vast, intimidating, and impeccably curated to project power. A massive mahogany desk, clear of all clutter, dominated the space. On a credenza behind it, a row of gleaming awards for corporate leadership stood like soldiers at attention. A framed photograph of Richard shaking hands with a smiling president rested on a side table, and enveloping it all was a breathtaking, two-walled panoramic view of the glittering city. She ran her fingers over the cool, smooth surface of his desk, the place where he made decisions that affected thousands of lives. She had always felt small in this room, an ornamental guest. Tonight, she intended to conquer it. She heard the soft click of the door and turned. Leo stood in the doorway, his hesitation palpable. He looked from the ostentatious symbols of power to her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Eleanor," he breathed, as if unsure he should even be here. She gave him a slow, deliberate smile and walked towards him. She was wearing a simple, conservative navy blue dress, the kind she wore to board meetings for the foundation. It was her uniform of respectability, her armor. But tonight, it was a costume for the first act of her seduction. "He thinks he owns this," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel as she gestured around the room. "He thinks he owns me." Without breaking eye contact, she reached behind her back and slowly pulled down the zipper of her dress. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent office. The dress pooled at her feet in a heap of navy blue wool, leaving her standing before him in nothing but a set of stark black lace lingerie. The delicate, forbidden fabric was a shocking contrast against the room's masculine energy and her own poised demeanor. Leo's breath hitched. A low groan escaped his throat. He looked at her as if she were a celestial event, a beautiful, impossible apparition. "Eleanor, my God, you are so beautiful," he whispered, the words a raw, reverent prayer. That was all the invitation she needed. She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, and led him towards the desk. With a sweep of her arm, she cleared a space, sending a leather-bound day planner and a stack of financial reports cascading silently onto the thick carpet. She perched on the edge of the cold, polished wood, pulling him into the space between her legs. This time there was no frantic urgency, no clumsy haste. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply sensual exploration. He knelt before her, his hands tracing the intricate patterns of the lace on her hips, his gaze worshipful. "To do this here," he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's insane." She leaned down, capturing his lips in a slow, deep kiss. "It's justice," she whispered against his mouth. He unhooked the front clasp of her bra, and her full, round breasts spilled into his waiting hands. He worshipped them with his mouth, his touch, and Eleanor threw her head back, a soft, guttural moan escaping her lips. The view of the city lights spun behind her closed eyelids. She guided his hands, her own movements confident and sure. This was a dance where she was leading. She lay back on the vast expanse of the mahogany desk, the cold, hard surface, a shocking contrast to her heated skin. The polished wood reflected the glittering skyline and the even more intoxicating sight of their entwined bodies. He moved over her, and as he entered her, their eyes locked. There was no darkness to hide in this time, only the billion lights of the city serving as their witnesses. They moved together in a slow, powerful rhythm, a deliberate, sacrilegious act on the altar of her husband's ambition. His whispers were a litany of praise against her skin, and her responses were no longer hesitant moans, but clear, breathless commands. "Leo, please," she gasped, her fingers digging into the hard muscles of his back. "Faster." They moved as one, building towards a climax that was not a frantic release, but a powerful, soaring peak of shared defiance. As pleasure shattered through her, her cry was not one of surrender, but of triumph. Afterwards, they didn't speak for a long time. They simply lay entwined on the desk, amidst the ruins of Richard's ordered world. His sweat mingled with her perfume. Her leg was draped possessively over his. Below them, the city pulsed with light and life, utterly oblivious to the quiet coup that had just taken place on the 48th floor. This act had not been about shame or secrecy. It had been a claiming. By defiling the throne, they had consecrated it as their own. The single, defiant act in Richard's office had broken the dam. Their affair, born in whispers and sealed in a desperate, frantic moment, now flowed into a steady, dangerous current that ran beneath the surface of their lives. They became masters of logistics, architects of a secret world built in the empty spaces of the Vance Tower. They established a routine, a dangerous dance choreographed in the twilight hours. It was no longer about finding each other by chance. It was about creating opportunities with a deliberate, careful precision. They communicated through brief, coded text messages on phones registered under false names, a detail Leo had insisted upon with a seriousness that both thrilled and sobered her. A message from her saying, "Reviewing the Foundation's quarterly reports tonight," meant she would be there. A reply from him with a simple floor number, 29, was the location of their rendezvous. They learned the building's blind spots, its forgotten corners. Their secret geography expanded beyond the fraught symbolism of the 48th floor. They found a small, unused library on the 34th floor, its shelves filled with outdated legal books where they could talk for hours. They discovered a small, private screening room on the 15th floor, its plush velvet seats a comfortable nest in the darkness. These places became their sanctuaries, rooms that existed outside of her life as Mrs. Vance and his as a night shift janitor. In these stolen hours, they were simply Eleanor and Leo. Their intimacy deepened beyond the physical. He would bring her coffee, rich and dark, in a worn thermos from home, and it tasted more real to her than any five-star restaurant meal. She would save him a delicate, untouched pastry from whatever gala she had been forced to attend, a small, sweet offering from her gilded cage to his real world. They shared stories, dreams, and a profound sense of companionship that made the danger feel distant, a manageable risk. They had grown comfortable, perhaps even a little complacent, in the secret rhythm of their affair, believing they were invisible, masters of the shadows they inhabited. But the dance of deception is always performed on a floor of thin ice, and one night it finally began to crack. Their chosen spot was an empty office on the 29th floor. The entire floor was undergoing a minor renovation, making it an ideal location no one should have had any reason to be there. The air smelled of fresh paint and drywall dust. They had made a small nest for themselves on the floor, with a painter's drop cloth, the city lights their only illumination through the vast, unadorned windows. The mood was relaxed, intimate. He was telling her about his sister's recent acceptance into a prestigious graduate program, his face alight with a pride that made Eleanor's heart ache with tenderness. She was partially undressed, her silk blouse unbuttoned, his head resting in her lap as she stroked his hair. It was a moment of profound, simple peace, a stolen domesticity that felt more like home than her own penthouse. It was the sharp, metallic ding of the service elevator arriving on their floor that shattered the stillness. They both froze, every muscle tensed. It was a sound that didn't belong, a discordant note in their carefully composed symphony of silence. Leo was on his feet in a second, his body a shield in front of hers. "Get dressed," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through Eleanor. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny pearl buttons of her blouse. She could hear them now, footsteps, slow and methodical, and the unmistakable jingle of a security guard's key ring. They were too exposed. There was nowhere to run. Leo scanned the empty room, his eyes landing on a large executive desk that had been pushed against a wall covered in a plastic sheet. "Under here. Now," he commanded. He pulled her down, and they scrambled into the dark, cramped space of the knee hole, pulling the drop cloth with them to conceal the opening. They were pressed together in the darkness, her knees tucked against her chest, his arm wrapped tightly around her. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart against her back. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the office door. A key slid into the lock. Eleanor held her breath, a silent scream trapped in her throat. The door swung open, casting a long, distorted shadow into the room. From their hiding place, all she could see were a pair of scuffed black boots. The guard entered, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the walls, the covered furniture, the floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, convinced the sheer force of her terror would give them away. Time seemed to warp, each second stretching into an agonizing eternity. The guard walked slowly around the room, the crunch of his boots on some unseen debris, a thunderous sound in the silence. And then, the true horror began. In her frantic scramble to hide, her phone had slipped from her skirt pocket and lay on the floor, just a few feet from the edge of the desk. She remembered with a sickening lurch that she had forgotten to turn it completely off. It was on silent, but the screen was set to light up for calls. As if summoned by her worst fears, the small, dark rectangle suddenly illuminated the floor. The light was as bright as a spotlight in the darkness. And on the screen, in stark, accusing white letters, was a single name, Richard. Her blood ran cold. This was it. This was the moment her life would detonate. The guard, his back to them, was at the far window, peering out. But any second he would turn around, his flashlight would catch the unnatural glow. He would pick up the phone, see the name, and the entire fragile, beautiful, terrible world she had built with Leo would come crashing down. Leo saw it too. She felt his entire body go rigid. He made a tiny, almost imperceptible move, as if to try and reach for it, but it was too far, too risky. They were trapped, forced to watch this ticking time bomb of their own making. The guard turned from the window. He began his slow walk back towards the door. His path would take him directly past the phone. 1 step, 2 steps. His boot was inches away from the glowing screen. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness, the room seeming to tilt in the darkness. She was going to be sick. She braced for the inevitable shout of discovery, the click of a radio, the end of everything. Just as his foot was about to land beside the phone, the radio on his belt crackled to life with a burst of static. "Patrol on 29? All clear?" a tinny voice asked. The guard stopped. He lifted the radio to his mouth, his gaze directed towards the hallway. "All clear on 29, he grunted. "Lot of dust up here. Heading down." He took one final step, his boot landing on the other side of the phone, and walked out of the room without a backward glance. The door clicked shut, plunging them back into absolute darkness. They didn't move for what felt like a lifetime, listening to the silence, waiting for the sound of the elevator descending. Only when the building returned to its deep, ambient hum did Leo finally let out a long, shuddering breath. He carefully crawled out from under the desk and retrieved the phone, its screen now dark again. He helped her out, his hands gentle on her arms, but the spell was irrevocably broken. The warm, sensual bubble they had created had burst, leaving behind only the cold, sharp residue of fear. They dressed in a tense, clumsy silence, the simple intimacy of buttoning a shirt now feeling like a frantic preparation for escape. The air was no longer charged with passion, but with the grim, metallic taste of adrenaline. As they rode the service elevator down, standing a careful foot apart, the dangerous dance had taken on a new, terrifying meaning. When Eleanor finally reached her car in the deserted parking garage, she sat for 10 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel, unable to stop them from shaking. The thrill of the affair was still a potent, undeniable force, but for the first time it was eclipsed by the visceral, gut-wrenching terror of the consequences. The game they were playing was no longer just about stolen moments of joy, it was about survival. The week following their narrow escape was a week of absolute silence. The secret text messages stopped. The late-night drives to the city ceased. Eleanor existed in a state of suspended animation, the ghost of terror, a constant, cold companion. She replayed the scene in her mind 1,000 times. The glowing screen of the phone, the name Richard, a stark accusation, the heavy tread of the guard's boots just inches from their ruin. The fear was a physical thing, a knot of ice in her stomach that wouldn't melt. She told herself it was a warning, a sign from the universe to pull back from the abyss. She tried to immerse herself in her old life, to find comfort in the familiar routines of lunches and board meetings. But it was all hollow. The colors of her world leached away. The gilded cage had never felt more like a cage. The silence from Leo was the worst part. Was he scared? Had he decided she wasn't worth the risk? The thought was more terrifying than any security guard. By the 8th day, she knew. The fear of being caught was immense, but the fear of returning to the silent, beige emptiness of her life before him was unbearable. The brush with danger hadn't been a warning to stop. It had been a crucible that burned away her remaining hesitation. If she was going to risk everything, it would not be for stolen, fearful moments in the dark. It would be for a passion that was absolute, a fire so bright it was worth burning for. Her hands were steady as she picked up her secret phone and typed a message. It was only one word. Tonight. His reply came back in less than a minute, a floor number and a question. 34. Are you sure? She typed her answer without a second's thought. I've never been more sure of anything. The library on the 34th floor was their sanctuary, a forgotten room filled with the quiet, dignified scent of old paper and leather. When she arrived, he was already there, standing by the tall window, his silhouette framed against the glittering tapestry of the city. He turned as she entered, and the look in his eyes held all the fear and longing of the past week. They didn't speak. There was no need. They walked towards each other, and the space between them crackled with a new, potent energy. This was not the nervous tension of their early meetings, nor the frantic desperation of their first encounter. This was the profound gravity of a shared, conscious choice. He reached out, not to pull her into a desperate embrace, but to gently take her hand, raising it to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of fealty, of acknowledgement. With their eyes locked on each other, he began to unbutton her blouse, his movements slow and deliberate. In turn, her hands went to the buttons of his work shirt, her fingers brushing against the warm, solid muscle of his chest. They undressed each other, not with haste, but with a reverent slowness. Each piece of clothing removed a layer of their separate worlds being shed, until they stood before each other in the soft moonlight, bare and vulnerable. There was no shame, no hesitation. There was only the breathtaking truth of their bodies in the silent, sacred space. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that went far beyond lust. He laid her down on a soft leather couch, his body covering hers like a shield. "Tell me what you want." It wasn't a question of technique, but a plea for her to reveal the deepest parts of her desire, a permission to worship her completely. And she did. Not with words, at first, but with a slight arch of her back, a soft gasp as his hand traced the curve of her hip, a tilt of her head to grant him access to the sensitive skin of her neck. His touch was no longer just passionate, it was knowing. He mapped her body with his hands and his mouth, discovering and adoring every secret place, every spot that made her tremble, every nerve ending that set her on fire. The experience was a symphony, each movement a note, each touch a chord in a composition of pure, unadulterated sensuality. It built from a slow, melodic adagio of exploration into a driving, rhythmic crescendo of shared need. He was everywhere at once, his name a constant prayer on her lips. "Oh, Leo, right there. Please, don't stop." The words were a broken, breathless plea, the last vestiges of her control unraveling. He moved inside her, and it was a union so profound, so absolute, it felt like coming home. "Say my name, Eleanor," he commanded, his voice a ragged whisper against her ear as he moved faster, deeper. I want to hear you say my name. Leo. The cry was torn from her throat, a sound of pure, ecstatic surrender, not to him, but to the overwhelming force of what they were creating together. This was the moment from the beginning, the full context for that fragmented cry of pleasure and pain. This was the complete, unrestrained expression of their passion, a beautiful, reckless act of creation in the face of imminent destruction. Their bodies were slick with sweat, moving together in a perfect primal rhythm, a frantic dance on the edge of a cliff. The climax was not a release, but an explosion, a shattering of the self that left them both gasping, clinging to each other in the aftershocks, their bodies trembling in unison. In that moment, floating in the perfect, weightless aftermath, there was no Richard, no Vance Tower, no risk, no tomorrow. There was only the two of them, their hearts beating a frantic, matching rhythm against each other's chests, tangled together in the shadows. The symphony of flesh had reached its final, soaring note, and the echo was a moment of pure, devastating, and tragically fleeting peace. The peak of their passion, that symphony of flesh in the quiet library, had left Eleanor transformed. In the days that followed, she moved through her life with a new, secret luminescence. She was no longer a ghost haunting her own home. She was a woman with a vibrant, fiercely protected inner world. A small, knowing smile would play on her lips for no apparent reason. She found herself humming a tune while arranging flowers. The world seemed sharper, the colors more saturated, the air itself charged with a delicious electric potential. She had found a new center of gravity, and his name was Leo. This newfound bliss made her reckless. She felt invincible, wrapped in the intoxicating belief that their secret was so pure, so powerful, that the mundane world of her marriage could never touch it. She had compartmentalized her life so perfectly, she believed, that the two worlds would never collide. It was a beautiful, foolish, and tragically fleeting illusion. The first tremor in her perfect facade came not from a dramatic discovery, but from a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her husband. Richard Vance was a man who had built an empire by noticing things others missed: a flicker of doubt in a negotiator's eye, a slight dip in a stock's performance, a subtle change in a market trend. And he noticed the change in his wife. One evening, he returned from a business trip a day earlier than expected. Eleanor, who had spent the previous night with Leo, was still floating in a warm, sensual afterglow. As Richard entered their bedroom, she rose to greet him, and he pulled her into a customary, passionless embrace. He stiffened slightly, pulling back to look at her, his expression unreadable. "What is that scent?" he asked, his voice flat. Eleanor's heart stopped. In her blissful state, she had forgotten. She was wearing a faint, lingering trace of Nuit Fauve, her secret perfume, her scent for Leo. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her happy haze. "Oh," she said, forcing a light, airy laugh. The woman at the fragrance counter at Bergdorf's insisted I try a sample. "It's a bit much, isn't it?" The lie felt clumsy, transparent. Richard said nothing, but his eyes, sharp and analytical, held hers for a moment too long. He didn't believe her. She knew it. The seed of suspicion, small and dark, had been planted. After that night, the atmosphere in the penthouse began to change. The comfortable, empty silence was replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. Richard became a subtle, unnerving presence. His questions became more frequent, laced with a casual precision that felt like a cross-examination. "Who was that on the phone? You seem to be spending a lot of time on foundation work lately. Is everything all right?" He began to come home at unpredictable hours, his arrivals unannounced, making her jump every time the elevator doors opened directly into their foyer. The penthouse, her gilded cage, began to feel smaller, the walls closing in. Her prison now had a warden who was constantly on patrol. The fear began to seep into her secret world with Leo. The joy of their meetings was now tainted with a constant, gnawing anxiety. She would check her phone obsessively, her body tensing at every sound in the hallway. The carefree passion that had defined their last encounter was replaced by a hurried, almost frantic need, overshadowed by the constant threat of discovery. Leo saw the change in her immediately. The relaxed, vibrant woman who had emerged from her chrysalis was retreating, replaced by a frightened, haunted version of her former self. "What is it, Eleanor?" he would ask, his voice filled with concern. "What's wrong?" She couldn't bring herself to tell him the full extent of Richard's suspicion. Admitting it felt like giving it power, like letting her husband's world poison the only pure thing she had. "It's nothing," she would lie, trying to force a smile. "Just stress." But he knew, and the knowledge created a new, sad distance between them. Their beautiful escape was beginning to feel like a trap of its own, a place where the fear was now as potent as the pleasure. The unraveling accelerated. Richard, a man who trusted data more than emotions, would have started his own quiet investigation. He would have noted the late-night trips in her car's GPS history, the unusual activity on their security accounts. He was a predator, and he was patiently, methodically tracking his prey. The confrontation came on a Tuesday night, a week after the incident with the perfume. It wasn't a dramatic shouting match. Richard's fury was a cold, quiet thing. He waited for her in his office at the penthouse, a space that was a smaller replica of the one at the tower. He was sitting behind his desk, a tablet in his hand. "Eleanor," he said as she entered, his voice chillingly calm. "We need to talk." She stood before him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He didn't look at her. He looked at the screen. "There are some things I don't understand," he began, his tone that of a CEO discussing a business anomaly. "For example, your car's Easy Pass was logged exiting the garage at the tower at 2:47 a.m. last Thursday. You told me you were at a charity dinner that ended at 11. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. The security logs for the tower's service elevators also show an unusual pattern. Frequent unauthorized stops on unoccupied floors. The 34th floor, for instance. Your key card was not used." He finally looked up, and his eyes were not angry or hurt. They were filled with a cold, piercing contempt that was far worse. "You've been careless, Eleanor." It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact, a verdict. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her. All her carefully constructed lies, all her flimsy excuses, were useless against the cold, hard data he had collected. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to explain, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? Her silence was her confession, and it was all the confirmation he needed. He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "I don't even want to know who at Island, I just want it to stop." He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping in front of her. "This marriage, this life, is a contract. You have violated the terms. So, we will be making some new arrangements." The days that followed were a quiet, bloodless coup. He didn't divorce her. A messy divorce was bad for the brand. Instead, he systematically dismantled her freedom. Her personal driver was dismissed, replaced by a member of Richard's own security team who was a glorified warden. Her credit cards were suddenly declined, with a polite call from the bank explaining that her husband had placed a security hold on the account. Her car keys vanished from the small bowl by the door. She was a prisoner, confined to the penthouse and whatever approved, chaperoned outings he deemed necessary. Her secret phone, her only link to Leo, was gone, discovered and confiscated while she slept. The unraveling was complete. The beautiful, vibrant escape she had built with Leo had not just become a trap. It had been systematically demolished, and in its place, Richard had constructed a new, far more secure prison. She was more alone, more powerless, and more heartbroken than she had ever been in her life. The end of the affair did not come with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful goodbye. It came with a quiet, suffocating finality. Richard's control was absolute and insidious. He didn't need to raise his voice or use physical force. He simply reasserted his ownership of her world, systematically bricking up every escape route she had discovered. Her life reverted to its previous schedule of lunches, galas, and board meetings, but now each event was a supervised outing. Her new driver, a stern man with the eyes of a hawk, was never more than a few feet away. Her phone calls were monitored, her internet access restricted. The gilded cage had been reinforced with invisible, unbreakable bars of surveillance. She was more isolated than ever before, trapped not just by her husband's wealth, but by her own terrible secret. The silence from Leo was the cruelest torture. She had no way of knowing what he thought, no way of warning him or explaining her sudden disappearance. Did he think she had simply grown tired of their dangerous game? Did he think she had used him and then discarded him? The thought was a constant, dull ache in her chest. The memory of their passion, of the fierce, uninhibited woman she had become in his arms, now seemed like a dream of a different person. She would look at her own reflection and see a ghost, a woman whose body was present but whose soul was trapped elsewhere, forever listening for a footstep in a silent hallway on the 34th floor. Months passed in this cold, sterile limbo. Then, one evening, a message found its way through the walls of her prison. She was at the annual Vance Corp charity ball, held, as always, on the 50th floor of the tower. She was a perfect automaton in a silver gown, smiling, nodding, the very picture of the dutiful wife. Excusing herself, she went to the ladies' lounge to escape the noise for a moment. As she was fixing her lipstick in the mirror, an elderly cleaning woman, one of the few familiar faces from the night shift that she recognized, was wiping down the marble counters. The woman, whose name she thought was Maria, met her eyes in the mirror with a look of quiet sympathy. As Eleanor turned to leave, Maria moved to empty a wastebasket near the door, accidentally bumping into her. "Perdón, Senora Vance," she murmured, her head down. But in that brief, fleeting moment of contact, a small, thick envelope was pressed into Eleanor's hand. Her heart leaped into her throat. She concealed it in her clutch, her hands trembling, and retreated into the privacy of a stall. The envelope was worn, the paper soft. Inside was a single folded page, covered in Leo's neat, concise handwriting. It was not a love letter, full of desperate longing or recrimination. It was a letter of quiet strength, of kindness, and of goodbye. He wrote that he knew something was wrong, that he understood she hadn't just vanished by choice. He told her not to worry about him, that he was safe. And then, he told her his news. He had been accepted into a prestigious writer's workshop in Iowa, a program he had dreamed of for years. He had saved enough money. He was leaving at the end of the month. It was his chance, he wrote, to finally tell the stories he needed to tell. He didn't ask her to come with him. They both knew that was an impossible fantasy. Instead, he thanked her. "Thank you for the conversations," he wrote. "You woke something up in me. I hope, in some small way, I did the same for you. Be safe, Eleanor." And that was it. No, I love you. No, I'll miss you. But the sentiment was there, woven into every carefully chosen word. It was a release, a gift. He was setting her free from any guilt she might have felt, even as the news of his departure shattered the last tiny sliver of hope she had unknowingly harbored. She read the letter twice, then tore it into tiny pieces, flushing them away, destroying the last physical evidence of their impossible love. A year later, Eleanor Vance stood by the panoramic window of her husband's office on the 48th floor. She was waiting for Richard to finish a call before they descended to yet another gala. She was wearing a stunning black dress, the Vance diamonds glittering at her throat. To any outside observer, she was the same woman, the epitome of grace and wealth, perhaps even more poised and untouchable than before. But inside, she was a different country, a landscape forever altered by a seismic event. She looked down at the city, a breathtaking web of light and shadow, the same view she had once shared with Leo. The silence in the room was absolute, but for her it was no longer empty. It was filled with echoes. She touched the cold, smooth surface of Richard's mahogany desk and could almost feel the phantom heat of their bodies, a memory branded into the wood. The affair had not freed her. It had not allowed her to escape her gilded cage. In fact, it had resulted in the cage's bars being made stronger, her world smaller. But Leo had been right. He had woken something up in her. He had shown her the woman she could have been: passionate, courageous, alive, and that knowledge was its own kind of prison. She would play the part of Mrs. Vance for the rest of her life, a flawless performance. But now, she was always aware that she was acting. The memory of Leo wasn't a constant, sharp pain anymore. It had become a part of her, a quiet, haunting presence, a secret companion in her profound and permanent solitude. He was the ghost in the machine of her perfect life, the silent, unanswered question at the heart of her gilded silence. The love story of the CEO's wife and the janitor had no witnesses and no ending. It had simply dissolved back into the shadows of the great glass tower, a secret that would live and die with her, a symphony of flesh that only she could still hear.